Welcome to the Rundown. I am Corey Stevens, and this is episode 1. Here is what this show is about. Every week, I run down a handful of things that happened in the industry that affects your bank account. What tools are worth your money? Which ones aren't? One story from the history of the trade, because the trades are a lot older than most people give credit for, and the majority of the guys already solved half of the problems you run into today. And one thing that makes you better at running the business, not just the work. News, tools, history, education, that's the bulk of the show. Most business education for contractors is a guy who left the trades a decade ago, and he's mostly just telling you to raise your prices. I'm still in the field, and I still make my fair share of mistakes. And look, everyone's got their hands in your pocket right now, everything from tariffs, lenders, the state, and now even big tech. My job every week is to point at whose hand it actually is and what you can do about it. This is going to be a primarily live show, so strap in, grab yourself a beverage, and let's get after it. So the first big story I want to hit on, I'm calling the big squeeze. Construction input prices are up 8% year over year. Now, that is the producer price index, and that is what suppliers charge each other. That is not what you paid at the counter this morning, and the gap between those two things is most of what I want to talk about tonight. Because the PPI pricing tends to lag behind what you actually see at the supply house 6 to 9 months later. That same index, though it was up 8%, went down 0.5% in June. And the reason it went down is diesel. Wholesale diesel dropped 18% in a single month. And I want to actually get into explaining how all that works, because a lot of it actually confused me the first time I was reading through all these notes. That index isn't one price. It is the average of everything that goes into a job. Lumber, steel, concrete, fuel, and it's weighted by how much the industry actually uses. Most of that stuff is slow. A steel mill doesn't change its price 18% in a month. Drywall doesn't. Concrete doesn't. Those crawl a couple points at a time over like a quarter. Fuel isn't like that. Fuel trades every single day on a global market, and it swings like a stock. So you can have a month where lumber's up, concrete's up, and the whole thing looks like it's creeping the other way. Diesel falls off a cliff and drags the entire average negative anyway, which is exactly what happened in June, which is also how up 66% from last year and down 18% last month are both true at the same time. One of them is measuring the entire climb. The other is measuring just the last step that it took. So the story isn't really a straight line. The story is that this thing moves violently in both directions, and you're signing fixed-priced contracts against all of it. So moving on. If the average is 8% and last month was down, where is the pain actually coming from? And there's actually a good bit more to this than meets the eye. A lot of it comes down to metal. Actually, a huge chunk of it does. And I want to give you a number that isn't a percentage, because percentages don't truly mean anything until you feel them. Aluminum has this thing called the Midwest Premium, and that is not the price of aluminum. That is the surcharge to get it delivered in America. In January of last year, that was 24 cents a pound. This February, it went up over $1 a pound, which is the first time that's ever happened in history. And that is just the delivery fee, not the actual metal itself. Copper and steel have similar numbers. Hot rolled steel went from $694 to $1,002 per ton, and it rose 10 months in a row. Copper went from $4.82 to $6.29 a pound. And that's roughly 35%, if my math is correct. There is a very specific reason those three moved and things like drywall didn't. And that's where it gets kind of interesting. So we have a 50% tariff on aluminum, steel, and the majority of copper. That part's in the news, that part you've heard about. But the thing that's changed and that most people don't know is that back in April, they changed how it all got calculated. It used to be that they would tax the metal content of a product. Now they are taxing the entire thing. So if you buy a light fixture and 20% of it is steel, you are not paying a tariff on 20% of that fixture. You are paying that tariff on the entire fixture. And this is why stuff that you would never in your life consider a steel product has certainly gone up in price dramatically. Which raises the obvious question. Why are we importing this stuff at all? And why don't we just all make it all here? So I went and did some looking because I assumed the answer was it's all made overseas. And for aluminum, that is mostly true. There are 4 primary aluminum smelters left in the United States. 4. 2 companies and 4 states. About 85% of the aluminum this country uses is imported, mostly from Canada and the UAE. There's a new smelter planned in Oklahoma currently, but it would be the first one that has been built in this country since 1980. And the single plant would more than double America's entire aluminum capacity. One plant. That's how little of it is manufactured here. Copper's worse, and it's actually kind of bizarre. We have 2 smelters in the entire country. And the last one that got approved to be built was in 1971, and it never happened. So here's what happens. We mine copper here. Almost half of what we pull out of the ground gets shipped overseas to China, to Japan, because we can't process it ourselves. Then we buy it back, refined, and pay the freight both directions. We are, ironically, both a copper exporter that has a copper shortage. Steel is where things start to change a little bit. And this is where some of it starts to actually matter. I assumed steel was going to be the same story, and it actually isn't. We make our own steel. Imports are only about 16% of the market. So 84% of the steel is made here. Most of it in mini mills, most of it melted down from American scrap. And since the tariffs came in, imports are down 30% and domestic production is up almost 5 million tons. The policy worked and it did it exactly what it was supposed to do. And American hot rolled steel now costs 54% more than it does in Western Europe, and about 2.5x the world export price. American steel made in America out of American scrap, 2.5x what the rest of the world pays. Because once you tariff the competition out, the domestic mills don't have to beat an import price anymore. They just have to come in under the tariffed one. So they raise their prices right up under the ceiling, and you pay the difference on a product that never actually crossed the border. So this is a case where buying American doesn't actually save you. America priced itself to the tariff. So that's metal. Let's get into wood a little bit, because This, I think, affects a lot more people. I mean, it affects carpenters and a lot of other trades. Framing lumber is running around $487 per 1,000 board foot. A year ago, it was in the low 420s. So call that a 15% raise, and it's been drifting up all year, not spiking, which is almost worse because you don't notice the price going up only a penny or two per 2x4. But then you look back at your balance sheets for the past year, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, I have been paying significantly more for lumber than I was 6 months ago, 9 months ago, a year ago. And now here's the one I actually want you to catch on to. And it's the thing we just talked about with the index. The headline number and the number that hits you are two different numbers. Earlier this year, Commerce cut the duties on Canadian softwood. The anti-dumping piece came down from about 20.5% to 10.5%. A significant cut, don't get me wrong. It got written up as relief for builders, but except in October, they added a separate 10% tariff on softwood timber and lumber. Different authority, different bucket, but it stacks on top. So you add it all up, you have a 10.5% anti-dumping, a 14% countervailing, plus the 10% tariff, and all of a sudden you're at 35%, which is exactly what it was before anything got cut. They cut the duty, the price didn't move, and both of these things are true, and only one of them really makes the headlines. Now, cabinets. No one's warned you about any of this. And if you do any interior work, cabinets, vanities, millwork, pay attention to this because it's the only one that hasn't happened yet. There is a 25% tariff on imported kitchen cabinets and vanities right now. That was supposed to jump to 50% in January, and it got delayed at the very end of December. Delayed, not canceled. It's scheduled to kick in January 1st of 2027. So if you're quoting a kitchen for next spring with imported boxes in it, that's what you need to be thinking about. Those are the numbers. You have about 4 to 5 months of warning, which is a handful more than anybody got with all of the metals. Now, there is one bright side here, and I think it is actually mildly significant. Domestic hardwood is doing quite well because of all of this. Poplar especially. So anything interior, trim, painted cabinets that are actually made here in the States, millwork, etc., it competes directly with the Canadian softwood that just got expensive, and Appalachian mills are seeing orders fill up quite rapidly. So if you're specifying interior work right now, domestic hardwood is probably the way to go. It's just math. All right now, after all of those heinous numbers, there are a few things that is not on fire. So drywall is currently flat. It's actually down 1% over the past 12 months. And concrete moved 3.5% back in January, and then it stopped moving altogether. So if someone tells you that everything on your job got more expensive this year, it's somewhat true, but not entirely. And the next thing that never shows up on an invoice is what I was talking about earlier with diesel. Wholesale diesel, the producer price index, was 66% higher in June than a year ago, and then it fell 18% in June alone. Now, I want to be careful here because you buy diesel, for all the diesel truck drivers, you would know I was lying to you. And retail is actually forecast slightly down this year. They're about $3.50 a gallon against $3.67 from last year. So this isn't exactly showing up at the pump, but it is starting to show up in delivery fees and fuel surcharges and in what your supplier charges to put material on your site. And the other thing is, when it comes to the PPI numbers, as I said at the beginning, these lag. So you're not going to see the cost changes of these for another 6 to 9 months. So I want to actually break down the math on what this is actually costing, because it is really easy to just nod along when you're hearing percentages, but you don't really feel it. So I mocked up a small addition. I have one that is 16 by 24, and I priced it out for what it would have cost in materials 90 days ago. So the breakdown, I broke down by framing, metal, copper, all the electrical, windows and doors, concrete, drywall, all your trim and millwork, and then totals. So the framing package 90 days ago would have been $8,400. $6,200 for the metal roof, $4,800 for all the copper, $7,600 for windows and doors, $5,100 for the concrete, $2,900 for the drywall, $3,800 for all your trim, millwork, and doors, interior. Total material cost $38,800. Now, going back down that list from the top, framing lumber went up 15%. The metal went up 25%. The electrical copper went up 26%. Your windows and doors went up 8%. The concrete went up 3.5%. The drywall went down 1%. And the trim and millwork remained flat because all of the domestic stuff has been doing really well. But when you add all that up, you've gone up 12.4% on costs. So your $38,800 addition now is $43,616. That is a $4,816 price increase. And you look at what the index told you, 8%. Your job moved almost to 12.5% because your job is primarily lumber, metal, and copper. And the little things like the drywall and the concrete going down didn't really save you because it was a single-digit portion of your material costs. You didn't pay the average, you paid your part of it, and the same thing that we've been talking about. The part that I think is the hard part to sit with is that $4,800 doesn't necessarily come out of the customer's pocket depending on how your contracts are framed. If your contract's framed where the bid is good when the job's done, you've kind of just shot yourself in the foot. If your contracts are set up where the material estimate is only good for a certain period of time, and then it'll be reevaluated depending on price increases, that's another matter. But not everyone is laid out like that with all of their contracts. So if you're running on a 10 to 15% margin, that extra $5,000 is eating up a huge chunk of that margin on what is not a massive job. So you got to come up with some way to make up that extra $5,000, or you're just eating it. And the thing underneath all of this, materials reprice the day the supplier says so. Your contract doesn't. So look at your contracts and make sure that you are factoring in for material price increases if you aren't already. Now, every contractor I know has a system And for a lot of them, it's a truck. The estimate's in the truck. The customer's number is on a receipt in the truck. The change order was a conversation that you had while you're in the truck. Then you hire someone and you tell them just to follow your system. But what you actually mean is read my mind, but not as good at it as I am. So the third Wednesday of every month at 7 o'clock Eastern, I am going to start running a 90-minute workshop where we start to fix part of that. The intake and what you ask a customer before you ever price the job, in what order, and where it all goes until you do the job a handful of months later. We're going to break it all down with AI, and I'm going to help demystify about what it can do and what it can't do. No, it's not running your company, but what it can do is start to take some of the office work that you're doing at 9 o'clock at night and get it done in the truck before you pull out of the driveway of a potential job. I'm going to help you build it right alongside me. The workshop's going to be $100. And all you need is a device that can run something like Claude or ChatGPT. And you can even be on the free plan. AI is changing the industry and the world, whether we like it or not. So if you are already using AI or curious about what it can do for your business and give you hours back every week, the link is in the description and in the pinned comment at the top. Or you can go directly to workshop.thebuildledger.com. Next, I'm going to be digging into the data center debacles that are happening across the country. Kind of ironic. I'm just talking about AI. Now we're talking about AI more. 5 companies: Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Oracle. This year, they are on track to spend somewhere between $700 billion and $900 billion on capital projects. And about 75% of that is AI infrastructure, data centers. That is up 36% from last year. I want you to sit with that number for a moment because it's kind of ridiculous. Amazon alone is around $200 billion. Google's sitting around 175 to 185, and Meta is north of 115 billion. Now, before anyone yells at me, the money is not landing anywhere. It's landing kind of in a small handful of places. So Texas is currently getting the most data centers. They have about 140 that are under construction currently. Virginia is next up. They have 136. Then it falls off a cliff. Georgia has 56 and Ohio has 51. After that, we're down into the 20s and the teens for the most part. 63% of the planned data center starts are in the South, and the entire West half of the country is under 4% of all planned data centers. So if you're in places like Northern Virginia, Dallas, Columbus, Ohio, or outside of Atlanta, what I'm about to describe is happening to you right now, and you might already know it. If you're in a rural state like Pennsylvania or the Midwest out to the West Coast, probably isn't a factory currently. But I'm not going to stand here and tell you that big tech took your electrician when there's not a data center within a few hundred miles of you. But I think it is worth staying with this because I have a feeling a lot of this is going to start spreading across the country if people don't pay attention. So, if you are in one of the markets I labeled above, here is what is happening. A single one of these data center sites can take up to 4,000 workers during the course of the construction project. Think about what that does to the electrician supply in a metro area like Dallas. The Wall Street Journal reported guys earning 25 to 30% more on data center work in Phoenix, Columbus, and Northern Virginia. There are signing bonuses running anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000. And Northern Virginia electricians are clearing $120K. And here's the thing that convinced me that this is actually legit. Because it's not a recruiter's number. This is based off unions counting their own members. The electricians local in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area doubled between 2018 and this January and are currently sitting around 14,700 members. And the main reason they doubled is to keep up with all of the data center work that's happening. So if you're in one of these areas and your electricians are kind of disappearing all over the place, don't think he just got greedy or forgot about you. There's a high chance he got recruited by someone that could afford to pay him 30% more with a sign-on bonus on a job that runs for 2 years. Now, you could consider that betrayal, but you can also just say the guy's doing what he can to take care of his family, and a lot of people would also take that gig. Now, where this story starts to really get off the rails is Texas. There's a few headlines I'm finding where electricians are making $250,000. I don't want to use those too heavily because everything I could trace back to with those numbers was related to a staffing agency, a company whose main business is convincing people to switch jobs, and I don't know that you could say that's a neutral source. It's more of an ad with a statistic on it. But the numbers I do want to use are from wage surveys and union rolls, and they still went up. So if you look at what's happening to electrician wages by type of electrician nationally, general electricians primarily in the residential spaces, the wages went up around 4.6% year over year. Pretty typical, mostly keeping up with inflation. Commercial electricians, it went up nearly 10%, more than double the national average on general electricians. And that gap is, I think, where a lot of this story is. These data centers are taking so many electricians that it is grossly inflating the numbers of wage increases compared to the rest of the industry. Because what is actually happening is no one truly stole anything, but what happened is an industry that has absolutely unlimited money showed up and kind of found out what they can actually start to get all these electricians for. And it's a third more than most residential construction has been paying. You could call it a heist. You could call it price discovery. But regardless, someone ran the experiment and published the answer. So is the question, how do I get my guy back from the data center? Well, you're probably not going to. But one question is, what are you actually paying? And is it a number good enough that an electrician would consider sticking around rather than taking another option? Because sooner or later, depending on what state you're in, the guy might have another option. And that is what that 10+% is starting to tell. New tools on the job site. Again, we're on an AI kick tonight. I don't know why I picked a bunch of AI topics, but here we are. The number that says it's real now. Service Titan put out a report this year They surveyed over 1,000 people running contracting businesses, and 38% of them say they're getting measurable results from AI. A year ago, that number was only 17%. Not 38% trying it, not planning to look into it, measurable results. The number more than doubled in 12 months. There's a separate AGC survey that says 61% of firms are using AI or increasing what they spend on it. And that is up from 44% 2 years ago. Different survey, different question, but that's a much lower bar. I'm not going to put the numbers together and pretend it's one stat. But the number that I think is more useful, and it's the opposite of what you would think. There is a study that came out from MIT, and I want to flag it up front because it doesn't seem like it's peer-reviewed, and there's been a number of things I've found that push back against it. So take the numbers for what they are, but they looked at 300 AI rollouts against $30 to $40 billion worth of spending. And 95% of them produced no measurable return. Zero. Nothing on the P&L. Now, that sounds like an argument against all of this. But the part that got buried is that in over 90% of the companies they surveyed, the workers weren't using AI anyway on their own. They were using their own accounts on their own quietly while the official company rollout was failing. And they're starting to call it the shadow AI economy. So as these corporate programs are failing, the individual guys are figuring it out on their own and succeeding. So why does a company with 100 million fail while a guy that's just alone working in an office or out in his truck working alone doesn't? Part of it just goes down to how bloated corporate companies are. The big company has a data problem, a committee. They've got to get to IT to improve it. They need legal to review it and clean up 15 years of garbage in a system that no one's maintained. And by the time all that's done, the pilot's dead. You don't know any of that. You've on an independent contractor end, you have a truck, a notepad, a phone, and maybe a laptop or tablet, and you don't have anyone to ask permission from. You can just start. And I don't mean just buy something. There are real tools out there. There's everything from takeoff software that measures off a plan. There's proposal generators, scheduling that assigns crews. The estimating companies are claiming 6 to 8 hours saved per estimate. Take that with a grain of salt. It's all in their own personal marketing. But the main areas where contractors are actually using it today is in two places. Cost estimating at about 24% of them, and bid management at 22% of them. Here's where I would actually start, though. I don't think estimating's the place to start, because if it gets an estimate wrong, there's a lot more money on the line, and you won't catch it until maybe it's too late. Start where being wrong costs you absolutely nothing. Start with writing, because who likes writing? I mean, some people do, but who likes writing emails to people? The text that says, well, hey, my materials went up. Here's the new number. The email that says, hey, we're running 2 days behind. Or the one you've been putting off since Tuesday and now it's Friday. The follow-up on a quote that no one's answered in 2 weeks and you don't really want to reach out. Turning a voice memo that you recorded walking into a job into an actual written scope. The change order, and you're normally thinking, oh, I'll come back to that. Or maybe it's making your punch list. Answering a Google review without sounding like a lawyer wrote it. Deposit reminders, scheduling confirmations, the Monday message to your crew about what's happening this week. None of that is glamorous, and all of it is sitting on your phone or your laptop right now, making you feel bad every time you look at it. And that's exactly why it's the right on-ramp, not because it's the biggest win, because a mediocre written text doesn't really cost you anything. You would never hand it a bid on day one, but I think most of us would happily hand it something that you were dreading or it takes up your evenings. Now, things like change orders, it's not really admin, it just looks like it. So like this one, I kind of put on the fence. But with how many of us have eaten a change order because it lived in a conversation instead of writing? Customer says, we talked about it. You say, no, we didn't. And you're not going to sue someone over $1,000 or $2, or maybe you forgot to write all of it down. And then you're trying to rebuild what that change order was in your head at the end of the week. But that sort of stuff starts to pay for itself. It's a comms task on paper, but it starts to become a margin task in real life. Then there's one thing I see guys get backwards on this constantly. A lot of these smaller guys, when they're finally deciding to hire, they're hiring for the field first because they think they need another set of hands and someone to swing a hammer. But I think AI is actually going to prove cool for a lot of these smaller outfits and guys that want to stay small. It's going to help make him more efficient in the office so he can actually keep doing what he's best at. If you want to stay in the field, you can start having AI streamline so much of your admin work that you could stay in the field. Or it can make you far more efficient and your office far more efficient so you can actually start growing the company. 30 years ago, the call was just hire for the field. Now you have options. And frankly, when it all comes down to it, no one's going to be able to automate the actual physical work in the field for a decent while, especially on the residential end. The gap is just completely different now. Next, I want to get into some history. And I think this is a relevant topic. Not because things are about to implode, but anyone that's been around the industry for a while probably remembers 2008 and what happened to the construction industry. Most of us don't remember back to the Great Depression, but we have definitely felt financial downturns. I know in 2008, it hit my father really hard. He was out of work for a good chunk of the winter from 2008 to 2009. So the downturns are definitely relevant. So everyone thinks the economy is uniquely brutal. But let's start talking about the guys who built it when there was truly nothing. So between 1929 and 1933, employment in the construction trades fell by more than 80%. Housing starts dropped about 95%, not down a third, not cut in half, 95%. I should actually pull the numbers for 2008 and find out what those are. The carpenters' unions had 345,000 members in 1928. By 1932, it was down to 242,000. And in January of that year, their own general secretary reported that over 80% of the men who were left had no work. By 1933, fewer than 3 in 10 were employed as carpenters at all. A man working full-time construction in 1933 made less than half what he had made 4 years prior. Now, here's the part I didn't know until I started doing some digging. And it wasn't that people stopped wanting houses. People still needed houses, same as always. What disappeared was the money, which, I mean, it makes sense. The entire economy imploded. But how some of this happened, I found fascinating. And it's specifically how mortgages worked back then. Because it is nothing like what most of us would picture, and a lot of it actually explains the entire collapse. So you'd go to a bank for your first mortgage. They lend you 50% of the value of the house. That's it, half. The term was only 3 to 5 years. But it was interest only, no amortization. You made payments for 5 years, and at the end of it, you owed exactly what you borrowed on day one. And the whole principal came due in one lump. And then most people refinanced it, and then you did that again in 5 years. And again, it was not too common to have a paid off house for at least the average people, which means you had no equity from your payments. And the only way you ever gained equity was if the price of the house went up. Sounds interesting. And the majority of the people couldn't come up with 50% down, so they would take a second mortgage, and a lot of them would even take a third, at whichever rate the guy writing it felt like charging, because there was nobody regulating any of it. One historian described the whole thing as a crazy quilt. Land contracts, second and third mortgages, usurious rates, junk fees, short terms, balloon payments, and that was all normal. That was just how you bought a house in America. So, the banks go under, your 5 years are up, the principal's due, and there is no one left to refinance you. Not because you missed a payment, you didn't miss one. The loan just ended, and the money to roll it over didn't exist anymore. By 1933, somewhere between 40 and 55% of every home mortgage in America was in default. Not because the houses weren't wanted, because the plumbing underneath them was built out of paper. That's one of the things that we were talking about earlier tonight. Your single-family pipeline isn't thin because people quit wanting houses. It's thin because of what it costs to finance one. So how does a guy in the trade survive that season? Because some of them did. And this was interesting information to me. I'm a nerd at heart, and I love history. A lot of them were bartering. So you had a lot of tradesmen that were taking payment in eggs and milk and whatever came out of someone's garden, and there's documented cases of chimney builders who ran what amounted to a credit line, and he would do the work and draw against it in meat and vegetables. But the pattern underneath all of it, and it's the part worth looking and thinking about, it wasn't really the big outfits that made it. It wasn't the best capitalized ones. It was the ones who didn't owe anyone anything. Low overhead won, skill beat capital, and the guy with a way to get his tools and had no note on anything outlasted the guy with a yard, a crew, and a bunch of payments and wasn't leveraged. And in the middle of all of that, with a quarter of the country out of work, someone decided to build the tallest building on Earth, the Empire State Building. Ground broke in March of 1930. That's 5 months after the crash. They finished in 1 year and 45 days, and they came in 45 days ahead of schedule. Up to 3,400 men on that site in a single day, and they were doing 4.5 floors a week. Just think about the pace that they were doing with 1930s equipment. Compare that to commercial construction these days. 48 workers died building it, and when it opened, it was 75% empty, and for years it was called the Empty State Building. They built the most famous building on the planet at the time ahead of schedule into a market that didn't want it. Other things built during this time were the Hoover Dam, which again was built ahead of schedule, and thousands of miles of roads. One of the things when I was reading into the balloon loans was something that also came out of this era, on the back end anyway. Out of the wreckage came a bunch of things that you would recognize. The Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933, the FHA, under the National Housing Act of 1934, Fannie Mae in 1938. Start with the HOLC, because the scale of it is absolutely wild. Between 1933 and 1936, the government bought up 1 million bad mortgages for $3.1 billion. Averaged around $3,000 a house. That is roughly 1 in 10 owner-occupied homes in the country. And they didn't just extend them. They rewrote them into something that had never existed. A 15-year loan at 5% that was fully amortized. Which means for the first time ever, you could pay a house off for a lot of people. That was the invention. It wasn't interest rate, it wasn't the term, it was the idea that the mortgage ended and that you make a payment and you owe less because you're actually eating up the principal. Before 1934, that essentially did not exist in this country. And the FHA built it on purpose as an emergency measure to help stop the Depression. The 30-year part took longer. The FHA started at 15 and 20-year loans, and Congress didn't authorize 30-year loans until 1948, and only then on new construction. Existing homes had to wait until 1954. All through the 40s and early 50s, the average mortgage was still about 21 years. So the 30-year mortgage fixed wasn't born in a moment. It got built in pieces over 20 years out of a disaster. But it was built. Someone sat down and designed it, and every homeowner in America right now who won't sell because they're sitting on a rate, won't move, they're frozen, it's because of a machine that was invented to help get us out of the Great Depression. The thing that so many people are complaining about was the rescue. So did it work? Yes, and faster than you'd think. Housing starts went from 93,000 in 1933 to 126,000 in 1934 to 221,000 in 1935. More than doubled in 2 years. Carpenter wages went from 70 cents an hour at the bottom in 1934 to $1.10 by 1937. And the WPA alone put up 650,000 miles of road, 75,000 bridges, and 125,000 public buildings, and employed around 8 million people. A lot of the stuff that you still drive on today. The trade outlasted the worst economy in American history, and it did it for one reason. People always need shelter. It is one of the most recession-proof industries there is, and it doesn't feel like it during a bad quarter, but it's true, and there's 90 years of evidence for it. A couple weeks ago, the housing numbers came out, and every headline said the same thing. Housing starts jumped 19%. Rebound, recovery, things are turning around. But here's what actually happened. New starts went up to 1.43 million. That's real. But that gain was almost entirely multifamily. Apartments were up 76%. Single family down to 895,000, down 3.2% from a year ago. And permits, which is actually telling you what's going to be built, they fell another 3%, down to 871,000. So the number went up to 19%, but hardly any of those is actually putting more work in your pocket, unless there's smaller apartments that are actually wood framed. But that is 3 times the show where the input index that went down, but almost everything else went up because fuel dragged down the average. The Canadian duty that they cut, where your all-in number didn't move at all. And now a housing rebound that is entirely apartments. 3 different subjects. It's essentially the same trick. The headline gives you the average. You don't pay the average. You pay your part of it. Whoever wrote the headline isn't buying the material, and neither is the person who repeated it to you. Freddie Mac's number last week, or the final week of July anyway, 30-year fixed at 6.66%, 15-year at 6.04%. Now, a year ago, that same number was 6.72. 12 years, it's moved 8 basis points. I bring that up because there's a lot of people that have spent an entire year waiting to hire, waiting to buy the truck, waiting to spend money on marketing. I'm going to wait until the rates come down. And that's what the year of waiting bought. Essentially nothing. And you can't get that year back. I'm not telling you rates don't matter. They definitely matter enormously. I'm telling you that building your plan around the number that you can't control is not a great plan. It's a hope with kind of a spreadsheet attached to it. I want to talk about one small more thing before we start wrapping things up. California SB 779, the fines. This came out at the beginning of July. California's SB 779 went live, and if you are licensed in California, this already happened, and a lot of people out there probably didn't hear about it. Minimum fine for unlicensed contracting went from $200 to $1,500. That's the floor now, not the ceiling. It used to be $200 minimum with a $1,500 cap. They took the old maximum and made it the minimum. Nearly every other license violation now carries a $500 minimum. And the board can raise all of those with inflation every 5 years. Now, the stated reason for this is real. Judges were knocking penalties down to nothing on appeal, so enforcement had no teeth. Okay, there's truth to this. But you have to really understand who actually absorbs it. A lot of the big outfits have a compliance department for this. A lot of the smaller guys, not so much. Number 1, if a court system enters a judgment against you, a wage dispute, a contract fight, anything, you have 90 days to report it to the board. Miss that window, and your license is automatically suspended, not reviewed. Suspended. That's the one that gets the honest guy. You're not a fraud. You just had a bad job go sideways. You were busy and no one told you you were on a clock. The second one, as of January 1st, Attorney General can file suit directly to suspend or revoke your license over unpaid wages. They give the board 30 days notice, and if the Attorney General wins and the board hasn't stepped in, the board is bound to revoke. So here's the one action list out of all of this for all of the people in California. It takes 90 seconds. And if you have any judgment against you or anything in front of a court right now, put the 90-day court in your phone now. Not tomorrow, tonight, while you're thinking about it, so you can actually stay on top of it. Now, if you're not in California, and most of us are not, I don't know your state's version of this, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you the whole country is cracking down because I only checked the one state. What I'll tell you is to go look tonight and search your state's licensing board and the word 2026. And the thing that starts to get me is the industry needs 349,000 net new workers this year, 456,000 next year. 92% of firms say they can't fill the jobs they've already got open. And the enforcement agent energy is aimed at squeezing the guys who are already doing the work. That's the true disconnect. That's the whole thing. Coming up to an end here of this first episode. So I want to pull things together. Your material costs are up about 18%. The metals are carrying most of it. The tariff now taxes the whole product, not just the metal in it. Aluminum, we barely make anymore. Copper, we ship overseas to get processed. And steel, we do make here, and it still costs 2.5x the world price because there's nothing left to keep it honest. The housing bound you read about was mostly apartments, and single family dwellings is still shrinking. Rates went nowhere in a year. The state's raising fines, and big tech is buying your electrician. And the two things that actually work in your favor: AI is finally getting real enough to take the office half off your plate. And the guys who did this in 1933 with nothing did it by keeping their overhead low and not owing anybody. You're not powerless in this. You're just not going to get rescued by much of anything. One final piece of business, and then I'm going to sign off. If the workshop sounds like your thing, cool. Same link that I mentioned earlier. I'm not going to rehash it. I'm not here to sell you anything, or rather force someone to buy something. If it isn't, the timing's wrong, whatever, you can go to the same page and sign up for the email list. It's completely free, and it's mostly me talking about the things that I just spent the last hour talking about. Everything from pricing, contracts, cash, to things that are happening in the industry. And you can learn a little bit more about me in the first few emails. The link is again the same, workshop.thebuildledger.com. And I have one question for everyone that's listening. Materials are up again. Are you eating it, or are you passing it on to the customer? And if you're passing it, what are you actually telling them? What words are you using? Drop some of those answers in the comment section. I will be back next week with episode 2. And yeah, signing off. This has been episode 1 of the